If we could label 2020, most of us would probably label it the year of grief. Hi, I'm K.D. Gates. Thank you so much for joining me. I say we label 2020 the year of grief because we experience so much grief in different forms of grief. A lot of people experience grief through the death of a loved one. A lot of people experience grief due to loss of job, loss of income, worry, being stressed, being bound by worry. So all of those are different forms of grief, and they all require us to accept it, feel it, release it, and then to heal from it. And I say that about a lot of things, especially death of loved ones. For me, I lost my mother this year in July 2020 of cancer. She fought a brave battle. She was my best friend, just the greatest mother a girl could ever have. And I lost her in 2020, and I had never suffered grief that way. Yes, I lost my father, but I was much closer to my mother. She was in my life. She raised me, and I had never suffered grief on that magnitude before until my mother passed in July. And so I had to really come to terms with grief and what it was and how to understand it, how to process it, how to accept it, how to release it and let it go and then heal from it. And that's where a lot of people get stuck in grief. Something about grief that just blows my mind is that it doesn't even need our permission to come and hinder us. Grief keeps us bound without our permission. It has no work to do. We just simply allow it to come in and just take a seat. It doesn't even take a seat. It rents out a room without paying rent. It just sits there. Because for many of us, we have not been taught how to properly release grief. And primarily because we have not come to terms with, if there is life, then there's death. See, the two work hand in hand. If we live, we shall die. And so a lot of us have not been able to come to terms with that very term or that very thought, because where there's life, there's death. And it's very sad when we lose a loved one because we've had them here in our space for years. For me, my mother, for 40 years, this lady raised me and loved me and taught me and cared for me and embraced me and kept me safe to the best of her ability. And then for her to be snatched away from me would leave somebody like, what on earth just happened? I was not finished with her yet. How dare? How dare she leaves this earth and I was not finished with her yet? That's the way a lot of us feel. We start questioning things. We start questioning who we are, our faith, our beliefs, because we feel like, but I wasn't done with that person. I had a lot more stuff to say and do, and a lot of questions that I needed answered. And I had all of these plans for him or her, and bam, just like that, blink of an eye, they're gone. And so we have not been taught the process of grieving because, like life, there is a process to grief. There's a process to death, and death doesn't always happen on our terms. A lot of the times we can't even prepare for death because it just happens just like that. So it does not happen on our terms. And that in itself leave a lot of us bound. So for me, what I learned, and I pray that this helps you, grief for me, I learned to accept it. Because we have to accept death. When someone dies, no, we don't want them to go. And in our minds, we're thinking, well, this can't be real. But in reality, it is real. So we have got to accept the death process. So acceptance, we've got to accept it. Then we have to feel it. This is when we have to let down those walls, drop that ego, all of that stuff that we're holding inside to stay strong for everybody else around us. We have to feel it. So you have to accept it. You have to feel it. Then once you feel it and come to terms with, okay, death happened and I had no control over death, then you have to release it. You have to let it go. See, that's the hardest part. See, this is why grief comes and rents a room without paying rent. Grief comes because grief knows that most people that are grieving have a deep inset fear of letting it go. Because most people that grieve feel or think that if they release the grief and completely release the grief or the pain, that they're going to release and forget the person that they're grieving. Oh, that is so good, because that is real truth. People hold on to pain and to grief because most often they feel that if they completely release the grief, okay, grief, you have no business here in my space and in my place. You must go now. I am releasing you and I'm releasing you completely. Most people feel that if they do that, if they release the pain and the grief, they're going to release and forget the person that they're grieving. See, that's the trick of grief. That is not true. You will not forget the person that you are grieving, but that person that you are grieving will be ever so happy that you release the grief. Think about it. That person that is gone was a person that you loved. That person loved you. So you have to know deep in your heart, somewhere in your mind, your spirit, your soul, your heart, that that person is not joyful. That's the word. One of my favorite words of all time, joy. That person is not joyful to see you sit here and grieve while they have went on to wherever the Father has taken them to. They don't find joy in watching you grieve. So you will not forget the person if you release the grief. If you let the grief go, you're not going to forget them. So don't let that be a trick of the mind. And something else that I've noticed or learned about grief on my journey is that grief becomes the weight no one wants to carry. That is good. Grief becomes the weight no one wants to carry. And why should we? We're not supposed to carry the weight of grief. That's why we are to accept it, accept it, feel it, release it, and then heal from it. So accept, feel, release, and heal. Because grief is a weight no one should carry. It's not meant for us to carry. And so I've noticed a lot of grief around me, a lot of grief in 2020. And most of that grief has to do with death. Yes, we grieve when we, lose a job, or when we have a loss of income, or when someone is hurting and we feel like we can't help that person. Yes, we grieve that way too. But most often, most of us have the trouble of letting the grief go when it deals with death of a loved one. But there is a method to it. Because something else about grief is if we don't let it go and fully let it go completely, grief keeps us bound. Yet again, it's that cage that I always speak about. We're that bird in the cage, and we have wings that aren't broken. But we cannot fly free because we are bound to the cage. Even when the cage is not fully closed. We bound ourselves in this cage and we can't fly free because we refuse we're fearful of letting go the things that we know we need to let go to allow us to fly free. Grief is one of those things. I wrote a few key notes about grief. Grief is the thief of life. It's one of those things that come to steal and kill and destroy our joy, especially if we don't let it go. That's when it becomes a thief, because grief is a natural part of the process of life, because where there's life, there's death. We grieve when someone dies, but when we can't let it go, it takes a seat. Remember when I said that earlier? It takes a seat. It rents a room without paying rent. That's when grief becomes the thief of life. That's when we're kept bound to that cage, even though it's not closed. We bound ourselves. Grief keeps us stuck in the past. We can't move into the future because we're still stuck in the past of grief. And most often, too, we're stuck with grief because we have all of these woulda, shoulda, couldas in our minds. Well, what if? There's that what if. Well, what if I did this? Or what if I did that? Would that person still had did this? Or would that person still had been gone so soon? Or some of us say too soon. Yet again, we don't control life. So there's no such thing as someone gone too soon. We can't control the process of life because those people don't belong to us. Yes, we have the power to speak life and death, but when God makes the choice to call someone home, there at that moment, we can petition, we can, pray, we can do all of those things that we should do. But when God makes that final decision, then we have to be we just have to be so okay that his decision is the best decision. And of course it would be, because if you are a believer like myself, then we have to know that God, the creator, makes no mistakes, none. So we don't know the why. And that too keeps us bound to grief, especially when someone leaves the world in a manner that we feel is very contrary to who that person was. So we have these what ifs stuck in our minds, or should I have stuck in our minds, and all of the shoulda, wouldas, or couldas, or we have to accept the fact that we can't control the actions of others. It goes back to that acceptance part of the relief of grief. So we have to accept death, no matter how it happened. We have to accept it, and we have to understand that we can't control the actions of others. See, all of these things play hand in hand with healing from grief, because once we accept it, we feel it, we release it, and then we heal. But in order to accept it, we have to get out of the space of woulda, shoulda, couldas. We have to delete the thoughts of what if, because we can't control those things. So that's another side effect of grief and how we become bound to grief. We have got to hold grief accountable. It has a job to do. But once it does its job, we can't allow it to stay there. We have to move past grief, and we have to, like I said, release the past, because it will keep us chained. It keeps us bound. And we have got to release the fear of being okay with death, because that too keeps a lot of people stuck in grief, because they feel like if they come to terms or accept the death, that it's saying that they're okay with that person's death or with the way that person left the earth. That's not what releasing the grief is saying or showing or doing. You're releasing the grief so that you can heal. You can live now in the present moment. Because the past has passed away. It's gone. The future is yet to come. But we're now in the present moment. But if we're stuck and bound by grief and all of these other things that come with grief, such as depression, if we're stuck and bound by those things, we're living in the past, although the past has passed away. We can't move into our future. So therefore, we're operating in jobs and different things that are contrary to who we are. They're not meant for us to be there. Because we're not operating in the present moment, because we're stuck in the past. We don't want to embrace the future because we feel like if we embrace the future, tell the future, okay, come on, I'm ready for you. We're forgetting our reason for being stuck. And sometimes I think we stay stuck too, not on purpose, not, consciously, because we're comfortable. We get comfortable there. Comfort is a natural human process. We get comfortable. Cannot say that word today. We find comfort. I'll say it that way. We find comfort in different spaces and places and different times that we've been in. So we stay stuck there. And that too keeps us from releasing the grief. I know for me, a personal side note, like I said, my mother passed away in July. She was my best friend. And I remember I went into my closet because I was petitioning God to keep my mother here. I want my mother to be here because I'm not finished with her yet. So I'm in my closet and I am petitioning. I'm praying. I'm sweating. I am out of breath. I am like literally out of breath as I am petitioning, pleading to God. Don't take my mother yet. And something that gave me peace that surpasses all understanding. If you don't know what that is, I will note that Bible verse, because even if you are not a believer, I'm going to encourage you to read that. God gave me peace that surpassed all understanding when he told me, yes, I heard from him, and no, I'm not crazy. When he said, but she's not yours, she does not belong to you. And I was like, oh my goodness. It was just peace that surpassed all understanding for me. Even the grieving process, I have to know that if God told me that, and he's given me peace that surpasses all understanding, how dare I sit and weep and mourn and do all of this crying for my mother when I know whose hand she's in? And because I am a believer, I have to believe the word of God. I remember having a conversation just yesterday, and I was talking to someone about crying and, weeping and grieving. And I remember saying to them, I could cry. I could just lay in my bed all day. I go to my mother's house. I sit there, I lay in her bed. I'm there. I do a lot there. I could be depressed. I could be all of these things because that lady was my best friend. I could go as far as to say I felt like she was one of my lifelines. But all of that crying and weeping and mourning and all of that stuff that brings about suppression and depression and all of these other actions, what is it going to do? I'm not saying that you can't cry to release the grief. That's not what I'm saying. Let me make that clear, because crying is natural. It's the natural cleansing process of life. But when we start crying uncontrollably all the time, that's when it becomes a hindrance to the process of life. So I just pray that this has helped someone. If you have a problem with releasing the grief, please drop me a comment. I would love to hear from you. I'd love to talk with you. And like I said, grief becomes the weight no one wants to carry, and that's because it's not meant for you to carry. So I just pray that this has helped you today. If it has, please like the video, share the video, because more people are grieving. More people are going through the process of grieving, and they feel like there is no one that can help them. They feel like everything they've read and they've heard is null and void. It's dead end. A lot of people feel that way. A lot of people feel like, well, no one could ever know how I am feeling. But there's a lot of people that know. So share the video. I don't care if you don't subscribe. You don't even have to like it. Just share the video. But I'd be happier if you were to subscribe and like the video, leave a comment. Thank you all so much for joining me on this very brief video on grief. I am going to do a more extensive video speaking on grief and a more in-depth look at the steps of acceptance of death, the feeling, the releasing, and the healing, because it has got to happen in those steps. So that's very vital. So I love you all so much. You have a beautiful, beautiful day. And thank you once again for joining me. Bye.